It was just another typical day at the grocery store when an encounter unfolded that no one expected. The lines were long, the checkout counters crowded, and the hum of the fluorescent lights filled the air. Among the rush of customers was one woman, clearly irritated, whose patience was running thin. She stood at the counter, impatiently tapping her foot as she waited for her items to be scanned by the cashier. But what seemed like an ordinary transaction quickly escalated into something much more charged. As the cashier, just another young person doing their job, scanned her items, the woman's annoyance grew. She rolled her eyes at the slow pace and sighed loudly, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. She muttered under her breath, but that wasn't enough. She raised her voice, making sure that the cashier heard her. "I can't believe how slow you are," she snapped, her words sharp and laced with a sense of entitlement. "You're really making me wait like this for no reason." The cashier, who had been working tirelessly all day, felt the sting of the woman's words. But instead of shrinking away or responding with anger, something unexpected happened. A calmness took over the cashier's demeanor, and in that moment, a powerful comeback was born. "You know," the cashier began, with a hint of calmness in their voice, "I've been here longer than you've probably been in this store, and you're not the only one with a schedule." The tension in the air was palpable. The woman's face flushed as she realized that she had underestimated the person standing in front of her. But it wasn't just the cashier's words that shocked the woman, it was the way they carried themselves. This wasn't just some passive worker who would meekly accept the insults. No, this was someone who was about to make her regret her behavior in a way that would be unforgettable. The woman, now caught off guard, tried to regain control of the situation. Her voice grew louder, her tone more insistent. She couldn't back down now, she had to assert her dominance. But the cashier wasn't backing down either. They had already decided they wouldn't let this moment slide by. And then, with a simple, yet incredibly powerful statement, they completely turned the tables. What happened next? Well, that's a story you won't believe. It was one of those moments where words became weapons and the person everyone thought would be the victim ended up being the one who left a lasting impact. This wasn't just about customer service or a simple transaction, it was about dignity, respect, and the kind of strength that you don't always expect to find in the most unlikely places. But before we dive into the rest of this story, you're probably wondering, how did the woman respond? Did she realize her mistake, or did the confrontation continue to escalate? Was the cashier's comeback enough to make her think twice about her actions? Or did she dig her heels in even further, determined to prove her point? Stick around to find out, because what happens next is not only a jaw-dropper but a testament to the power of standing up for yourself when you least expect it. The woman stood frozen for a moment, her lips parted, as if trying to find the right words to respond to the cashier's cool yet firm reply. It wasn't the kind of response she was used to hearing. Most people, especially in service roles, would have cowered under her gaze, apologizing profusely or offering some kind of excuse. But the young cashier didn't flinch. They didn't even seem remotely concerned about the woman's temper. It was as if they were completely unbothered by her attempt to assert control over the situation. The tension in the store grew heavier, and the murmurs of nearby customers filled the silence, but no one dared intervene. The woman, though visibly rattled, wasn't going to let her pride take a hit. She tried to regain some semblance of authority by leaning over the counter, her eyes narrowing as she looked the cashier up and down. "Don't you talk to me like that," she spat, her voice a little shakier than before. "Serve me, not lecture me." The cashier's calm expression didn't waver. There was something about them, something in their posture, that suggested they weren't about to back down. It wasn't the kind of anger you'd expect to see from someone in their position. It was something else. It was quiet strength, the kind that comes from years of handling difficult situations with grace. The kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and not allowing anyone to push you around. As the standoff continued, the woman's grip on her purse tightened. She could feel the eyes of the other customers on her, judging her actions. But she wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone in a service position. The world had always bent to her will. If she complained enough, if she made enough noise, things changed. People apologized. People tried to make things right. This cashier, though, wasn't playing by the same rules. Behind the scenes, the store manager, a middle-aged man who had been busy organizing shelves, glanced up at the growing scene. He could sense that something wasn't quite right. The air was thick with tension. He started walking over, but he wasn't quite close enough to intervene yet. It was obvious that this situation was escalating, and he didn't want to make things worse. The woman, frustrated and embarrassed by the cashier's unflinching attitude, raised her voice once more. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her face turning bright red. "You think you can talk to me like that and get away with it?" But instead of shouting back, the cashier simply paused, looked the woman in the eye, and said something that none of them expected. "You think I'm here for you?" The cashier said, their voice soft but firm. "No, I'm not here for you. I'm here for the job, for the paycheck, and for the people who treat me with respect. You're just another customer, and if you can't handle waiting in line, maybe you should try shopping somewhere else." The words hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, the woman stood there, blinking in disbelief. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. The arrogance that had guided her every move felt suddenly irrelevant. The power she thought she had in that moment was slipping away, and it left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. But then, just as quickly, she regained her composure. She wasn't about to let this cashier get the best of her. She wasn't going to allow some young worker to make her feel small. She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, the store manager finally approached. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but with a hint of authority. He looked from the woman to the cashier, assessing the situation. The woman was quick to jump in, trying to shift the blame. "This cashier is being rude to me," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "I've been waiting forever, and they're acting like I don't matter. I just want to get through this, but this person is making it impossible." The manager turned to the cashier, who didn't flinch at the accusation. The young worker wasn't fazed by the woman's complaint. They simply nodded, as if they had anticipated this response. "I didn't say anything out of line," the cashier replied. "I'm just doing my job. If you can't handle waiting in line, maybe you should try coming back later when it's less busy." The woman's eyes narrowed at the casual dismissal. She was furious now, the anger bubbling up inside her. How dare this person speak to her like that? Who did they think they were? The manager glanced between them, weighing the situation. He could see that the woman was in the wrong, but he also understood the delicate balance that had to be maintained in customer service. He didn't want to escalate things further, but he couldn't let the situation continue like this. "All right," he said, trying to defuse the situation, "I think we should just calm down. Let's take a deep breath and remember that we're all just trying to get through the day here. If you need help, I'm happy to assist you, but we need to keep things respectful." The woman, seething with anger, crossed her arms tightly across her chest. She was furious, but now the power had shifted. The manager wasn't taking her side, and the cashier wasn't backing down. She could feel her control slipping further, and it made her more upset than she cared to admit. "You know what?" she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "I don't need this. I'll take my business elsewhere." With that, she snatched her items off the counter and stormed out of the store, the door slamming behind her. The moment she left, a quiet sigh of relief seemed to sweep through the store. The tension that had built up over the past few minutes began to dissipate. But as the door closed behind her, the cashier's gaze never wavered. They stood tall, unshaken, their eyes reflecting a deep sense of inner strength. The store manager looked at the cashier, nodding with approval. "Nice job," he said quietly. "That could have gone a lot worse, but you handled it well." The cashier simply shrugged, their expressions still calm. "It's just another day," they replied, turning to finish their work. The store was quieter now, the chaos of the moment fading into the background. But the events of that day would stick with everyone involved. For the woman, it was a humbling reminder that not everyone is willing to bow to her demands. And for the cashier, it was a quiet victory, a victory not just for them, but for anyone who had ever felt disrespected or overlooked in a world that often rewards arrogance. As for the manager, he knew that things weren't always as they seemed. What appeared to be a simple altercation was a deeper reflection of the dynamics between customers and employees. It was a reminder that respect wasn't something that could be demanded, it had to be earned. But what about the woman? How would she respond to this? Would she take the lesson to heart, or would she continue to think she was above others? The story wasn't over, and there was still more to come from this unexpected encounter. Would she return to the store, seeking an apology, or would the next chapter in this confrontation be even more dramatic than the last? The suspense was in the air, and it was clear that this story wasn't finished yet. The real question was, what would happen when the two worlds collided again? The store was quieter now, but the ripples of that confrontation were far from over. As the day wore on, the incident continued to occupy the minds of those who had witnessed it. The store manager went about his duties, trying to put the awkward moment behind him, but the uneasy feeling lingered in the air. He couldn't shake the thought of how quickly things had escalated, and more importantly, how easily they could have turned much worse. Meanwhile, the cashier went back to their work, scanning items, bagging groceries, and greeting customers with a level of professionalism that seemed unshakable. But inside, their thoughts were swirling. They had worked in retail for years, faced countless rude customers, and dealt with their share of disrespect. But something about the woman's outburst had struck a deeper chord. It wasn't just the anger, it was the entitlement. The sense that she could demand anything and everything, without even a moment's consideration for the person on the other side. And it wasn't the first time they had experienced that feeling. It was a reminder of the struggles they'd faced growing up, of a world that often placed more value on appearances and status than on kindness and decency. Yet, the cashier couldn't deny that something had shifted in that moment. The response they had given, the calm defiance, had felt powerful. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about standing up for themselves in a world that often overlooked their worth. It had felt like a small victory, but one that carried weight. And as they continued their shift, they couldn't help but wonder what would happen if others stood up the same way. If more people, no matter their job or background, learned to hold their ground, how would the world change? Back outside the store, the woman was still fuming. She had left in a hurry, determined not to show any sign of weakness. She wasn't used to being challenged, and the sting of that cashier's words had stayed with her long after she had stormed out. She drove home, gripping the steering wheel, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. How dare they talk to her like that? How could someone so young, so insignificant, speak to her with such disregard? When she arrived home, she slammed the door behind her and tossed her purse onto the couch. Her husband, sitting in the living room with a newspaper, looked up in surprise. "What happened? You look upset." "It's that stupid store," she snapped, her voice sharp. "That cashier was unbelievably rude to me. I've never been treated like that before. They actually had the nerve to tell me to leave." Her husband raised an eyebrow. He was used to his wife's dramatic outbursts, but something about this one seemed different. He set the paper aside and leaned forward. "What exactly happened?" She recounted the details, her anger growing with each word. "I was just standing there, waiting like everyone else, and they couldn't even scan my items fast enough. I had a lot to do today, and I asked them to hurry up. But instead of apologizing, They just looked at me like I was some kind of inconvenience. And then, when I said something, they told me to leave. Her husband was silent for a moment, taking in what she had said. He had never been one to challenge her, but even he could tell that something was off about this. He knew she had a tendency to expect special treatment, but even he could see that the cashier's response didn't sound entirely out of line. Still, he wasn't going to say that out loud, not right now. Well, maybe you should just call them and get an apology, he suggested cautiously. If they were really that rude, maybe they'll make it right. The woman's eyes narrowed. I don't want an apology. I want them to understand who I am, to know that I deserve respect. I'll show them that I'm not someone they can treat like that. The seeds of a plan began to form in her mind. She was going to make sure that Cashier learned a lesson. She didn't care if it meant making a scene. This wasn't just about a small insult, it was about respect, about making sure that people knew their place. If she could make this cashier apologize, truly apologize, she would feel vindicated. She would feel powerful again. The next morning, she returned to the store, her mind set on confronting the cashier. She had spent the night stewing over what had happened, convinced that she was in the right. This time, however, she was prepared. She would make sure they understood the consequences of their actions. The store was quieter than it had been the previous day, with fewer customers milling about. The cashier was behind the counter, scanning items for a customer who seemed too busy to notice the tension that lingered in the air. The woman approached the register, her heart pounding in her chest. She was ready to make herself heard. As she stepped forward, the cashier looked up, their eyes locking. For a moment, time seemed to slow. I'm back, the woman said, her voice steely. And this time, I'm not leaving until you understand just how disrespectful you were yesterday. The cashier's expression remained unchanged. They didn't flinch, didn't even seem surprised. Is there something I can help you with? They asked, their tone polite but distant. The woman took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. She wasn't going to let this person dismiss her again. Yes, there is. I want to speak to your manager. Right now. The cashier didn't hesitate. They didn't argue. They simply nodded and turned to the back of the store to fetch the manager. As the woman waited, the room seemed to close in around her. The anger inside her churned, but beneath it was something else, a feeling she hadn't quite expected. Doubt. Maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. But it was too late now to back down. When the manager appeared, he immediately recognized the woman from the previous day. His eyes flickered briefly toward the cashier, who remained quiet and still, their face unreadable. He could sense the tension building once again. How can I help you today, ma'am? The manager asked. The woman didn't waste any time. She launched into her complaint, recounting the events of the previous day and emphasizing how unfairly she had been treated. Her words were sharp, filled with the same anger that had fueled her drive to return to the store. The manager listened patiently, nodding along as she spoke. He had been trained to handle these situations delicately. But as she finished, he turned to the cashier, expecting some kind of explanation. Instead, the cashier simply shrugged. I'm sorry you feel that way, but I stand by what I said yesterday. I was just doing my job. The words hit the woman like a slap in the face. She hadn't expected that. She thought for sure the cashier would apologize, or at the very least back down. But they didn't. They stood firm, their calmness only adding to the fury boiling inside her. Excuse me? She said, her voice rising again. You're still acting like this isn't a big deal? You think you can just treat people like dirt and get away with it? The tension in the air was almost palpable. The manager took a step back, sensing that things were about to go off the rails again. He wasn't sure how to resolve this situation, but one thing was clear: the confrontation wasn't over. It had only just begun. The woman's voice shook with a mix of disbelief and rising fury. You really don't get it, do you? She spat, her eyes narrowing as she fixed the cashier with a glare. The silence between them felt thick, charged with something far more intense than simple frustration. It was as if every word, every movement, carried the weight of the past few hours, the standoff, the simmering anger, the clash of egos. The cashier didn't flinch. They didn't look away or even seem the slightest bit intimidated. They were steady, unmoving, their posture still strong and unyielding. The store manager, caught between the two forces, felt his pulse quicken. He had never seen this kind of confrontation escalate so quickly. He had dealt with disgruntled customers before, but this was different. The woman's anger wasn't just about waiting in line or a slow cashier, it was something deeper. It was about power. And the cashier wasn't playing by the usual rules. Ma'am, the manager said, trying to maintain control of the situation, I understand you're upset, but we're not going to resolve this with anger. Let's just take a step back. You don't need to escalate this further. His voice was calm, but there was a tremor of uncertainty in it. He had no idea how this was going to end, but he could feel the tension in his chest tightening by the second. The woman, however, wasn't hearing him. Her eyes never left the cashier's face. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her fists clenched at her sides. The words she had prepared, her defense, her justification, were now tumbling out of her in a flood of frustration. You think just because you have a job behind this counter, you can talk to me like that? You think you can get away with treating people like I'm nothing? She took a step closer, and the cashier's unwavering stance only fueled her outrage further. For a brief moment, the room seemed to shrink. It was as if time itself had stopped, leaving just the woman, the cashier, and the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights hanging above. The customers nearby, still in the store, pretended to be busy, stealing glances at the unfolding drama, their own unease reflected in their movements. The manager, now visibly nervous, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could, the cashier did something that made everyone freeze. I think, the cashier said, their voice firm and resolute, you've forgotten who's in control here. The words echoed in the air, piercing the tense silence like a sharp knife. The woman's face flushed. For a brief moment, her eyes widened as she processed the audacity of the statement. It was as if she had expected everything up until that point, a confrontation, a complaint, maybe even an apology, but this was something different. She had thought she was in charge of the situation, but now, standing before this young person who had never backed down, she realized that the power dynamic had shifted in ways she hadn't anticipated. For a split second, the store was quiet again. The customers stopped pretending to be busy. It felt like the weight of the moment hung in the air, drawing everyone in, holding them hostage in the suspense of what would come next. The woman's breath quickened. Her face twisted in fury as the words sank in. She had always been the one in control. She had always been the one who made the rules. But here, in this moment, in this store, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: vulnerability. It was a feeling she loathed more than anything else. She took another step forward, glaring at the cashier, her eyes narrowed and cold. You don't get to talk to me like that, she hissed, her voice shaking with emotion. I will not let you disrespect me. You're going to regret this. You'll see. You'll all see. The manager, sensing that the situation was nearing its breaking point, finally took a deep breath. He stepped forward, trying once more to calm things down. But before he could get a word out, the cashier spoke again, their voice steady and unwavering. You're right, the cashier said, their words cutting through the tension like a blade. I don't get to talk to you like that. But you also don't get to treat me or anyone else like that. You don't get to walk through life thinking the world owes you something, just because you're frustrated with your own problems. The woman's lips parted, and for a moment, it seemed as though she was about to respond, perhaps to lash out again, to raise her voice even higher. But something in the cashier's tone, something in the quiet defiance of their words, made her hesitate. It was as if they had just stripped away the walls she had built around herself, exposing her to a truth she wasn't ready to face. For the first time in years, the woman wasn't in control. She didn't have the upper hand. And she wasn't sure how to handle it. The tension reached a fever pitch. The customers around them watched with bated breath, unsure of what would happen next. The woman's face was contorted with rage, her fists clenching and unclenching at her sides. But instead of shouting, she stood there, frozen, as if the weight of the situation had finally hit her. It was the cashier who broke the silence this time, their words carrying a finality that no one expected. "If you want respect, you have to give it first," they said, their voice soft but carrying an undeniable power. "And if you're not willing to do that, then there's nothing left to say." The woman opened her mouth to retort, but no words came out. For the first time, she found herself at a loss. She had built her entire life on the idea that she could get whatever she wanted, that she could demand respect without earning it. But in this moment, in this store, in front of everyone watching, she realized that maybe, just maybe, that wasn't true. She stepped back, her face flushed with a mix of anger, humiliation, and something she didn't fully understand. The manager glanced between the two of them, unsure of what to do next, but sensing that this was a moment for resolution, not escalation. He didn't know how to end this, how to bring closure to the confrontation, but he understood one thing: the story wasn't finished. It was building to something that would change everything. The woman, her expression now unreadable, turned on her heel and walked toward the door, her footsteps heavy with the weight of the moment. No one moved. No one spoke. They all just watched, waiting for the next chapter of this tense and unpredictable story to unfold. And as the door swung shut behind her, a lingering silence hung in the air. What would she do next? Would she come back for more? Or had this encounter left her with a lesson she wasn't yet ready to accept? The tension still hung in the store like a storm waiting to break, and no one knew exactly what was coming next. But one thing was certain: the story wasn't over. The door swung shut behind the woman, and for a moment, the store seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The tension in the air was thick, and the customers who had been quietly watching the exchange began to disperse, returning to their shopping with quiet murmurs and stolen glances. But something still hung in the air, a feeling that something wasn't finished, that the confrontation wasn't over. The cashier stood at the counter, their eyes never leaving the door through which the woman had just exited. Their mind was racing. The woman's anger had been palpable, but their response, though calm, had been deliberate, too deliberate. They had known that this wouldn't be the last time she would walk through those doors. Something in their gut told them that this wasn't just a case of one rude customer. No, this was something much bigger. The manager, still standing nearby, tried to regain his composure. He had seen some tense moments in his time at the store, but this was different. This was a battle of wills, and as much as he wanted to distance himself from the chaos, he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was about to escalate. He turned to the cashier, attempting to ease the tension. "Hey, you did well back there. I know it was tough." The cashier nodded, though they didn't feel like they had done anything remarkable. They had simply held their ground. But they weren't naive enough to think that the woman's exit was the end. If anything, they had a strange feeling that the worst was yet to come. The hours passed, and the store seemed to return to a quiet normalcy. Customers came and went, oblivious to the storm that had just passed through. But in the back of the cashier's mind, the nagging feeling persisted. They couldn't shake the thought that something else was waiting, just around the corner. Something that would change everything. As the evening approached, the cashier's shift was nearing its end. They were finishing up a transaction when the bell above the door rang again. Without looking up, They assumed it was just another customer. But then, the unmistakable sound of heels clicking on the floor caught their attention, and their hearts skipped a beat. The woman was back. This time, however, she wasn't alone. She was flanked by two other figures, two men, both wearing suits, their expressions unreadable. The atmosphere in the store shifted once again, and the cashier's stomach sank. They could tell right away that this was no ordinary return. The woman wasn't here for a simple apology anymore. She had come back with a mission. The manager, still present in the store, tensed visibly as the group walked through the door. He straightened up, instinctively preparing for the storm he knew was coming. He glanced at the cashier, then back at the woman, trying to gauge what exactly was going on. The woman didn't waste any time. She approached the counter, her eyes locked onto the cashier, her gaze colder than before. The two men beside her stood silent, watching everything unfold. The atmosphere was so charged it felt as if the air itself might catch fire. "Let me make something very clear," the woman said, her voice calm but laced with an icy edge. "I've had enough of this. I've already spoken to my attorney, and I've made arrangements. You will be hearing from them soon." The cashier froze. Their mind raced, trying to process what was happening. An attorney? Why would she need a lawyer over a simple customer service dispute? But before they could even think about responding, the woman continued, her words deliberate and final. "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to make sure you understand the consequences of treating people like me with disrespect. I've got enough connections to make your life difficult. And trust me, I will. Consider this a warning." The cashier's pulse quickened. They didn't know what she was talking about, lawyers, consequences. It all seemed so out of proportion to what had happened. All they had done was stand their ground when she tried to push them around. But now, as the weight of the woman's words sank in, the reality hit them hard. This wasn't just about one rude customer. This was personal for the woman. She had something else in mind, something far more dangerous than just a confrontation at the counter. The manager stepped in, trying to defuse the situation before it spiraled any further. "Ma'am, I'm really not sure what you're suggesting here, but there's no need for threats. We can discuss this calmly and reach a resolution. Let's not make this worse than it already is." But the woman wasn't listening. Her gaze remained fixed on the cashier, her expression unwavering. "I'm done talking," she said. "My attorney will handle this from here." The two men in suits flanked her even closer, and the tension in the store thickened, suffocating any remaining hope for de-escalation. It was clear that she wasn't just here to resolve a conflict. She was here to intimidate, to make her mark. And as she turned on her heel and began to walk toward the door with the two men in tow, the cashier realized that this was no longer just about a small disagreement. This had turned into something much bigger, something with far-reaching consequences. As the woman exited the store, the bell chimed again, but this time, it felt ominous, as though the sound was a signal, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The manager looked at the cashier, his face pale. "I don't know what's going on, but we need to be prepared," he said, his voice shaky. "If she's really involved with attorneys, we could be facing something serious." The cashier could feel the weight of it all bearing down on them. The stakes had just been raised in a way they hadn't expected. This wasn't just a battle of words anymore. There were bigger forces at play, forces they didn't fully understand yet. And the feeling in their gut, the one that had told them this wasn't over, grew stronger. The woman would be back. But next time, things would be different. The quiet moment of tension in the store had already given way to a storm that was brewing, one that was about to explode in ways no one could anticipate. The store was quiet again, but the calm was fleeting. The cashier couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep inside them. The woman's threat, the mention of lawyers and connections, those words had been a stark reminder that this wasn't just a simple customer complaint. There were layers to it. Layers they didn't fully understand. Hours passed, but every minute felt like an eternity. The evening rush began to wind down, and just when the cashier thought they could relax, the door swung open again. This time, they didn't have to guess. They recognized her instantly, the woman, her icy demeanor now a familiar presence. But she wasn't alone this time. The two men in suits were back, but there was a new addition. A third figure, this one dressed in a sharp blazer, walked with purpose. The energy in the room shifted, and the manager's face paled when he saw them enter. He moved quickly toward the counter, standing between the woman and the cashier. "Ma'am, I think we've already discussed everything," the manager said, trying to maintain his composure. But there was an edge in his voice now. He wasn't sure what this was about, but he had a gut feeling it wasn't going to end well. The woman's smile was cold, calculating. She stepped forward, this time without a hint of hesitation. "Oh, we haven't discussed everything. In fact, we're just getting started." The third figure, who the cashier now recognized as a lawyer, held up a file. The papers were thick, and the weight of them felt heavy, like an anchor sinking into the pit of the cashier's stomach. "This is a legal matter," the lawyer said, their voice crisp and professional. "I've been hired to handle the situation. My client here feels deeply wronged by the way she was treated." The cashier's pulse quickened. This was the moment they had been dreading, the moment when everything could fall apart. They'd heard of people being sued over much less misunderstandings, small incidents, but the idea of going to court, of facing something so serious, felt surreal. They had never imagined a simple disagreement would lead to this. "We've got witnesses," the lawyer continued, flipping through the pages in the file. "People who saw the confrontation and are prepared to testify that the cashier's behavior was inappropriate. If you don't settle this matter now, it could escalate further." The room grew quiet. The customers who had been shopping now stopped in their tracks, listening intently. It felt as if the air itself had thickened, and every pair of eyes in the store was on the cashier. For the first time, they felt the weight of being judged, not just by the woman but by everyone around them. They tried to steady their breath, but it was hard. Every inch of their body was screaming in panic. How had things gotten so out of hand? They hadn't wanted this. They hadn't meant to stand up for themselves in a way that would lead to this kind of fallout. But then, just as they were about to speak, to apologize, to beg for mercy, something unexpected happened. The manager, who had been standing still and silent up until this point, took a deep breath and turned toward the lawyer. "I'm not sure where you're getting your information," the manager said slowly, his voice firm, "but we don't need to drag this through the courts. We can settle this right now." The woman's expression faltered for a split second, and the lawyer paused, sensing that something wasn't as it seemed. "What do you mean?" the lawyer asked, his voice still cool but laced with a hint of caution. The manager looked over his shoulder at the cashier, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I've reviewed the security footage," he said, his voice calm but full of authority. "And it's very clear that the situation was not as one-sided as you're making it out to be." He turned back to face the woman and her entourage. "In fact, your behavior, your intimidation tactics, the threats you've made, and your actions here today are all on camera." The room went silent again. The woman's face shifted, her eyes flickering with something like fear, but she quickly masked it with a look of disdain. "What are you talking about?" The manager smiled coldly, finally gaining some ground. "I've reviewed every angle of the footage. You didn't just walk out in anger. You made threats, and you've been harassing my employee ever since. The law's pretty clear on harassment, and if you continue down this road, we will have no choice but to file charges against you for intimidation and defamation." The lawyer, clearly rattled, began flipping through the file, his calm demeanor now slipping. The woman's grip tightened on the papers in her hand, but there was a hesitation in her stance, a crack in her confidence. For the first time, It seemed like the balance of power was shifting in the cashier's favor. But before anyone could say anything more, the cashier took a step forward. Their voice, although shaky, held a quiet strength. "You're right. I didn't want to make this a bigger issue than it had to be. But I won't be bullied, not by you or anyone else. If you really want to take this to court, then let's do it. I'm ready to stand up for myself, and I won't back down." The woman's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, it seemed like time stood still. No one had expected the cashier to speak like that. They had expected a retreat, a plea for mercy, but instead, they were met with defiance. And in that moment, it was clear that the power dynamic had shifted completely. The woman, once so confident and determined, now looked uncertain, her posture stiffening. A beat passed, and then the unexpected happened. The lawyer, looking defeated, slammed the file shut. He exchanged a quick look with the woman, who suddenly seemed smaller, less imposing. "You'll hear from us again," the lawyer muttered under his breath, clearly deflated. The woman, her eyes burning with barely contained rage, spun on her heel and walked out of the store, the two men in tow. The silence lingered in the air, but this time it was different. The tension had broken, and with it, a sense of relief washed over the store. The customers who had been watching the entire exchange slowly resumed their shopping, but the atmosphere had changed. There was an air of respect now, a silent acknowledgement that the cashier had stood their ground. The manager turned to the cashier, a look of surprise and perhaps even admiration on his face. "Well, I have to say, I didn't see that coming," he said with a quiet chuckle. "You handled that better than I could have ever expected." The cashier didn't respond immediately, their minds still processing what had just happened. The adrenaline was still coursing through their veins, but deep down, they felt something they hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of pride. They had faced down a bully. And in the end, it was the woman who had walked away defeated. But just as they thought the story had ended, something caught their eye. An envelope slipped under the door. The cashier hesitated, then opened it, reading the contents in disbelief. There, at the bottom, was a single line. "This isn't over." The twist was clear. It wasn't just about a confrontation in a store anymore. The game had changed, and this was only the beginning. The cashier stood motionless, the envelope still in their hands. Their heart pounded as they read the single line of text once more, "This isn't over." It was a simple statement, but the weight of it felt immense, like a storm cloud that had yet to burst. They hadn't expected this to be the end. After everything, the confrontation, the threats, the lawyer, it felt too easy to think it was over. They glanced at the manager, who had been watching them closely. His face was a mix of concern and curiosity, his brow furrowed as he saw the expression on the cashier's face shift from determination to something resembling dread. "What's that?" he asked, stepping closer. The cashier looked up, their voice quiet but steady. "A letter. It says it isn't over." The manager let out a deep breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "This could get messy. If she's serious about taking legal action, we need to be prepared for whatever comes next. I'm not sure what she thinks she can do, but we should keep our eyes open." The cashier nodded slowly, their minds still racing. The idea of a legal battle, of more threats, was enough to send a shiver down their spine. But they couldn't back down now. They had fought too hard, stood their ground too firmly. If this woman wanted a fight, then they'd give her one. But they weren't about to let themselves be intimidated again. The real question was what to do next. How would they prepare for the inevitable? Over the next few days, the store became a battleground of sorts. The cashier found themselves second-guessing every move, anticipating every phone call, every interaction, wondering when the next shoe would drop. Their coworkers noticed the change in their demeanor, how they were more cautious, more guarded. But they also saw the resolve in their eyes, the quiet strength that had emerged in the wake of the confrontation. They had come out of this situation stronger, despite the uncertainty that still loomed over them. One afternoon, a week after the letter had arrived, the cashier was on their lunch break when they received a phone call. It was from a number they didn't recognize, but something about it made their stomach churn. Hesitating for only a moment, they picked up the phone. "Hello?" There was a pause on the other end before a voice they had heard all too recently spoke. "Is this the cashier from the store?" The voice was smooth, cold, too professional to be anything other than the lawyer from before. "Yes," the cashier said, their voice steady despite the tension building inside them. "I'm calling to inform you that my client, the woman you had an altercation with, has decided to pursue legal action. We'll be filing a formal complaint with the store's management and with the authorities. She's prepared to take this as far as necessary." The cashier felt a wave of nausea hit them. It wasn't surprising. In fact, they had been waiting for this moment, but hearing the words out loud made it feel all too real. "What exactly does she want?" they asked, trying to keep their voice calm. "It's not about what she wants anymore," the lawyer replied, almost as if bored. "It's about what she's entitled to. She believes you violated her rights, and she's prepared to make sure you're held accountable for your actions." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Violated her rights? What had they done wrong? All they had done was stand up for themselves, push back against a bully. But in the lawyer's eyes, it didn't matter. They were just another defendant in a legal game, an unfortunate pawn in a battle that was about to escalate. The cashier hung up, feeling the weight of the conversation settle heavily in their chest. They had no choice now but to brace for what was coming. But deep down, they also knew that no matter how this turned out, they had already won. They had stood their ground. They had refused to let someone walk over them. That had to count for something. In the days that followed, the tension continued to build. The store's management began to take the matter more seriously. They contacted their own lawyers, preparing for the possibility of a lawsuit. The employees were all on edge, whispering about the situation and wondering who would be next to feel the brunt of the woman's anger. But as the situation grew more intense, something unexpected happened. A breakthrough came in the form of a quiet phone call from the store's corporate office. The woman's threats, it turned out, had been more bark than bite. After reviewing the footage, after looking into her claims, the corporate team had decided that her case was flimsy at best. The woman's lawyer, though persistent, wasn't prepared for the strength of the evidence that the store had. The footage, the witnesses, the written records, it all painted a picture that didn't match the woman's version of events. Slowly, but surely, the case began to unravel. The cashier didn't know exactly when the change happened, but one day, out of the blue, they received a call from the lawyer. "We've reviewed the situation, and after further discussion, we've decided to drop the case." The words were almost too good to be true, but they were real. The woman had backed down, her legal threats fading into the background. The cashier exhaled, relief flooding through them as they set the phone down. It was over. The nightmare had ended. But more importantly, they had won. Over the following weeks, things returned to a semblance of normal. The store carried on as usual, and the cashier, though wary, felt a sense of closure. They'd faced down an impossible situation, one that seemed destined for disaster, and come out on the other side stronger than ever. The power of standing up for themselves had been proven, not just in the courtroom or through legal threats, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing they hadn't given in to fear. They'd learned a valuable lesson through it all. Sometimes, the loudest voice isn't the one that wins. Sometimes, it's the quiet strength of standing firm in your convictions that makes all the difference. The woman was never seen again in the store, and while the cashier couldn't shake the feeling that there might always be people out there like her, people who tried to bully their way through life, they knew that they would be ready next time. They had learned that they didn't need to be afraid. No one could take away their dignity unless they allowed it. The final chapter of the story was a simple one, The cashier had become something more than they were before, a person who had found the courage to stand tall, even when it felt like the world was against them. They had emerged from the storm, stronger and more confident. And while the store carried on, its shelves stocked with the usual products, the cashier knew that they would never be the same again. They had faced their fears, and in doing so, had won something far more important than a victory over one customer. They had won their own respect.